and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many of you joining us here today. I know more people are just coming in a bit late and are in the waiting room, and we will get started right away. So my name is Rochelle Friesen, and I'm the Canada coordinator for Christian Peacemaker teams. As many of you know, because this group just hosted Christian Peacemaker teams a couple of weeks ago. CPT does have a peace and human rights team right now in Hebron, and they are doing amazing work. And so maybe you can go back a few weeks and hear a bit more about the work that we are doing. But thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering as we address the issue of Israel's use of the military court system to prosecute Palestinian minors. So before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcasted live on Facebook. And so if you do not wish to have your face seen across social media, please turn off your video feed, which is just the video button at the bottom of your screen when you move your cursor around. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being shared in the chat so that many, many more people can join us for this really important session here today. We are now inviting people from the audience to tell us how you are applying Kumi Now back in your own community, or otherwise, how are you advocating for Palestine? I know a lot of us are doing tremendous work and throughout the pandemic have been working behind the scenes. And so if you have an idea or a project you'd like to share in a future meeting, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com with your idea. So now it's time for our weekly activism survey. Mark, could you launch the poll? And please note that there are 3 questions. So scroll down in order to be able to see them all. And we are just going to give a few seconds to answer. So there is the poll. One is just helping us gather information what actions you took. It's great to see some of these answers coming in. We'll wait for a few more people to answer the questions. So the first question is about social media. On your Facebook account, check in to Gaza for 1 week with a photo that says Open Gaza in solidarity with those who actually live there. So it's checking to see what sort of things that you did. But as we move to the second question, which is about today, what do the majority of Palestinian children in the military court system have in common? And seems that we have very brilliant people already in this session, because the answer is B. They live or are arrested within a kilometer of a settlement. And the third question, according to Military Court Watch, what should all children accused of a crime receive? And again, very smart group. The answer is all of the above. So way to go, everybody, on answering these questions. We hope that you will find this session interesting and informative. And I'd like to start off by having everyone you'll be hearing from today introduce themselves. And so I'll ask Omar to introduce himself first, and then Gerard.
Thank you, Rochelle. My name is Omar Harami, and I will be presenting an update from the ground from the Jerusalem office. Gerard?
Hi, my name is Gerard Horton. I'm a lawyer and co-founder of Military Court Watch, based in Jerusalem, and I'll be speaking tonight.
Thank you. And we look forward to hearing more from you later, Gerard. But for now, Omar, would you be able to give us a bit of an update on what's happening on the ground?
Yes. So there's 4 important stories that I thought they are worth sharing. There's more topics that we send out on a weekly basis through the Sabil Wave of Prayer. If you are already registered, that's great. Please share the Wave of Prayer with friends and relatives. If not, please do register and receive the weekly Wave of Prayer. We send it out in 10 different languages on a weekly basis. This picture was taken from today from Sebastia, close to Nablus. This is the village with the traditional place of burial place of John the Baptist. It was attacked today by dozens of settlers and tens of soldiers. During the attack, they were doing a certain tour and they really started confrontation with the local community there. And they were attacking a young Palestinian boy, and the mayor of the village tried to defend the boy and was severely beaten by both the settlers and the soldiers. So please hold the mayor of the city, Muhammad Azim, in your prayers as he is recovering in the hospital. Doesn't happen very often, but today there was also a great success story. Close to the village of Taibe and Deir Jrir, there were 40 dunums that were under threat of being confiscation. There were settlers who have tried to occupy these this mountain, and the community has been engaged for months in civil disobedience, in almost daily demonstrations. Hundreds were arrested from the village, from the villages nearby, and today they dismantled the settlement. So this is a great success story. The people are hoping that the villagers and the farmers are hoping that the settlers will not come back. They were escorted by the police, by the Israeli army police, and that is something, an uplifting story. It's a testimony that nonviolence, resistance, and when people fight injustice, they do win. This is a story that has been really moving Palestinians throughout the country. The story is about Majid Barbar, and he has been in prison for 20 years. His daughter, his younger daughter, was only 15 days when he was arrested, and his his son was 1 year, almost 1 year, when he was arrested. He spent 20 years in Israeli jail, and there was a very big celebration within the communities when he was released. Unfortunately, he was arrested again for 1 day, then later released. Israel does not allow Palestinian prisoners to celebrate when they are released from prison. So, but this was really brought lots of joy. It was really a genuine happiness within the community. And it was a beautiful story. It showed the resilience and a beautiful story of a Palestinian prisoner being released, even after 20 years of in Israeli military jails. There was also another beautiful story from inside Israel, from Al-Haq al-Gharbiyya. And the prisoner, his name is, the Palestinian prisoner who was released, his name is Rushdie. He is from Al-Haq al-Gharbiyya, from the Galilee. And him and his friend, his best friend, is still in jail, serving 35 years. He's also destined to be released in the coming few weeks. In the picture, you find a little girl. Her name is Milad. Milad is also a common name that we use also for Christmas. And she was, and the prisoner smuggled the Palestinian prisoners every now and then who manage, they smuggle their sperms. Hopefully that there will be, in a way that there will, a pregnancy will take place with their spouse. And it was successful, although of the difficult age. And so the father, the Palestinian prisoner, his friend, Walid, will be released in the coming few weeks, and he will see his daughter, who was born when he was still in prison. She is almost 1 year old now. So this is also a beautiful story that even after 35 years in prison, there is still hope. There is still birth of the idea of freedom and a better life. So this was the news update from Palestine and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Really important updates there. Normally at this point, we would have a story from Denise Assad, our amazing, wonderful storyteller. However, she's taking a couple weeks off. I'd like to turn to our main issue of this week and to hear from Gerard. As Gerard speaks, if you have a question, please take time to write, and we will try and get to as many questions as possible later on in the Q&A. So go ahead and write your questions in the chat. So Gerard, please take it away.
Thank you very much. So I have 30 minutes tonight. What I shall try to do in that 30 minutes is give you a thumbnail sketch of how detention is used to, as part of the system of occupation and control in the West Bank. Just a little bit about Military Court Watch. So it's an organization made up of 10 individuals, mainly lawyers. Not all of us are lawyers. I'm a lawyer. And what we do is we focus just on one issue: prosecution of children, Palestinian children in the Israeli military court system. And one of the foundation stones of the work we do, or I should just add that those 10 individuals, they come from Palestine, Israel, Europe, and America. And sort of the main foundation of the work we do is to collect evidence. So each year we collect generally over 100 testimonies from children who are detained, and we analyze that evidence for a number of issues. Were they arrested in the middle of the night? How do they say they were treated? Were their rights under Israeli military law respected? And all of that evidence is compiled and is presented on our website. If you go to there's a tab on the main page called Comparative Graph, and that's updated regularly, so you can get a sense of trends relating to those issues. But there's always one particular feature of the evidence we collect that stands out as highly significant, and it was mentioned in the poll earlier, and that is the location of arrest. Around 98% of the children who go through this system live on average within about 1 kilometer of either an Israeli settlement or a road used by settlers. And that's not coincidental. And I'll go on to explain briefly why we say that is not coincidental. Before I do that, though, I shall just, I'll say a little bit about the military court system, how it was established, etc., very briefly. So on the 7th of June, 1967, less than 3 days into the 1967 war, Israel had occupied the West Bank. And on the 7th of June, they placed the whole of the West Bank under military rule. And Israel was perfectly entitled to do that on the 7th of June, 1967, by virtue of the Fourth Geneva Convention. I'm sure all familiar with that convention. That regulates occupations. And under that body of law, if there is an occupation, the entire territory can be placed under martial law. You can have military courts, and you can prosecute civilians in those military courts. There are obviously conditions. One of the main conditions is that it's supposed to be temporary. It's supposed to be temporary because obviously it's a very unsatisfactory situation. There's nothing actually in the law which says what temporary means. So that was the situation on the 7th of June, 1967. One thing that I think is quite interesting is the military order that established the military courts on the 7th of June, 1967, military order number 3, expressly referenced the Fourth Geneva Convention as the legal basis upon which Israel was acting. So Israel itself was relying on the Fourth Geneva Convention to justify placing the West Bank under military law and establishing military courts. So as of the 7th of June, there were no particular legal issues. As I mentioned, Israel was acting lawfully. What then happened after the 7th of June, 1967, is a political discussion took place inside Israel as to what to do with that territory. And those that wanted to keep it and settle it dominated. And the best evidence for that is by about September 1967, the first settlers started to move into the West Bank. And then, of course, you did have a legal problem because, as I'm sure you're all aware, that same convention that allows for military courts, military law on a temporary basis, also prohibits settlement construction in occupied territory. So that placed a dilemma on the Israeli military lawyers who, a few months earlier, had just drafted military order number 3, expressly referencing the Fourth Geneva Convention to justify what they were doing. And now in September, the politicians were allowing settlers into the West Bank. So they had to come up with some sort of solution to that. And I can tell you as a lawyer, the solution they came up with was not particularly sophisticated. What they did was they passed an amendment to military order number 3. And essentially what they did was just deleted all references to the Fourth Geneva Convention, carried on prosecuting Palestinians in military courts and settling the West Bank, and thought they would get around that two opposing positions by simply deleting references to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Be that as it may, that was the position in September 1967. Now, if we fast forward about 53 years or so to today, the latest data I've seen suggests there are around 700,000 Israeli civilians living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The split is about 450,000 in the West Bank and 250,000 in East Jerusalem. I would just focus on the West Bank because that's where military law is still in place to this day. So as I mentioned today, you have about 450,000 Israeli civilians living in the West Bank. And once the politicians in Israel thought that was a good thing to do, they then handed over the day-to-day responsibilities of actually making it work to the Israeli military. And I think if you pause for a moment and think about that, it's hard to imagine a more difficult military task any army could be given than having to guarantee the protection of 450,000 civilians essentially wandering around a conflict zone, living among about 3 million Palestinians in occupied territory. And yet that's the mission the Israeli military has been given. Now, how successful have they been in that mission? There are any number of ways you could try and analyze that. But if you just look at fatalities, the evidence suggests they've been extraordinarily successful. According to the US State Department, for example, in 2012, not a single settler was killed in the West Bank. Now that strikes me as an extraordinary military achievement. You have 450,000 Israeli civilians living in occupied territory, and in 2012, not a single one was killed. 2012, I have to say, was an extraordinary year, but I just looked at the data. If you go back 12 years, the 12-year average fatality rate for Israeli settlers in the West Bank is 4.9 settlers on average have been killed in the West Bank each year for the last 12 years. Now, not to trivialize those deaths when they occur, I think that is an extraordinary military achievement. And the question I think that raises then is, what are some of the tactics being employed by the Israeli military to achieve such an extraordinary result? And that's essentially where our work comes in, because we see these tactics on a day-to-day basis, and the military courts are very much part of these tactics. So now I'll turn to these tactics and say a little bit about those. And I'll do so by, I'll take just one example, a fairly sort of typical example that occurs in the West Bank, but there are many other examples of this. And that is of stone throwing. So imagine for a moment, the military commander in a particular area, Israeli military commander in a particular area in the West Bank, gets a call from a settlement that he's responsible for protecting. And someone tells him that he's seen a group of Palestinians on the side of a road used by settlers throwing stones. The question is, what is he going to do in response to that report? Now, that stone throwing incident, it might have caused damage, it might not have caused any damage at all, but the dilemma for that commander is, if people are on the side of roads chucking rocks at vehicles possibly moving at high speed, the potential for damage is there. But the question is, for that commander, what will he do in response to that stone throwing incident? Now, the first thing he knows from his experience is that if he sends a unit of soldiers to that location in the road to investigate, almost certainly anyone who was throwing stones there will have been long gone. No one's going to hang around. So the chances are he's not going to catch anyone. So that poses a dilemma for that commander. He's got an act of resistance. He knows it's Palestinians, but he can't positively identify anyone. So who's he going to arrest? Who will he prosecute in the military courts for that act of resistance? If he were to do nothing and say to himself, well, couldn't catch anyone today, maybe I'll have better luck catching someone tomorrow, the chances are he won't stay in occupied territory for very long. If you can have acts of resistance and people get the sense that they have a chance of getting away with that resistance, that will simply encourage more resistance. So that's not an option for that commander. But he's still left with the dilemma. Who is he going to arrest for that act of resistance? Essentially, what these commanders do is they make a couple of assumptions. They've got nothing to do with the law, these two assumptions, but I think from a purely military perspective, they're fairly reasonable. Assumption number one is that the stone throwers were Palestinian males, aged between about 10 and 30 years old, which will generally be the case. Assumption number two, they came from the nearest Palestinian village, and that too is probably going to be the case. What he then does is he takes those two assumptions and he passes those along to the local Israeli intelligence officer. So since June 67, the West Bank has been divided up into military jurisdictions, as you'd expect, but it's also been divided up into intelligence jurisdictions. What that means is that every Palestinian village, town, center of population in the West Bank has had a designated Israeli intelligence officer for the last 53 years. Possibly not particularly surprising. If you're conducting an occupation, you're going to need to gather intelligence. But what is possibly unique in this situation is because it has gone on for 53 years, an awful lot of intelligence has been built up on these communities. The kinds of intelligence the officers will have access to are obvious things like how many Palestinians live in that village, what are their political affiliations, who's a member of Hamas, who's a member of Fatah, who's not politically aligned at all. Perhaps more importantly, who has been arrested from that village before, particularly for stone throwing, if this is a stone throwing incident. According to UN data, something like 700,000 Palestinian men, women, and children have been detained in the last 53 years. So at these villages, Palestinian villages and towns located close to settlements or roads used by settlers, the friction points, one thing you can be quite sure of, and that is lots of people will have been arrested from that location before. And as happens quite frequently, and it's not unique to this situation, it happens all around the world to a greater or lesser extent. Sometimes when a crime has been committed, the police or law enforcement don't know who committed the crime, they round up a few of the usual suspects, people who they've arrested before for similar types of offenses. And that happens in the West Bank. So they'll look to see, who have we arrested from that village for stone throwing in the past? Let's round them up again, question them, see what they have to say for themselves. Final thing the intelligence officer does is perhaps the most important. And this is basically at the heart of how the West Bank is controlled. And that is, the intelligence officer will look to see who are the Palestinian informants or collaborators in that village. Now, it's difficult to get hard data on this for obvious reasons. No one's going to volunteer the information that they're a collaborator. But what we can tell you from collecting an awful lot of evidence over the years is it's quite clear that the West Bank has been thoroughly infiltrated. And the way that works is the interrogation room is frequently used to try and recruit people to provide information. Another method that is used probably the most extensively is the permit system. Now, you're probably all aware of how Palestinians in the West Bank need permits for all sorts of things, travel, movement, and also work. And it's the work permit system that is frequently used quite extensively to recruit informants. And the way that works is, first of all, as you probably be aware, unemployment rate in the West Bank is pretty high. In some refugee camps, it can rise to 70%. Now, if you can get a work permit from the Israelis to work inside either a settlement or inside Israel, that's a very valuable commodity. But understandably, if Israel is going to give a Palestinian from the West Bank a work permit, they will put them through a security check. If you pass that security check, then typically your work permit will be issued for 3 months, renewable indefinitely. Every 3 months, you can apply for it to be renewed, and frequently it is. What will often happen is no attempt will be made to recruit that person the first time they apply for the work permit. The idea being they go off to their job inside Israel or inside the settlement, they get used to the money, the income, and they start making plans for the future based on that income stream, on the belief that it will be renewed multiple times. Then what happens in 3 months' time, you have to go back and get that permit renewed. And that's frequently where the recruitment will take place. The officer will say, we can reissue your work permit, but this time we're going to need something in return. And that's used extensively. To give you a sense of scale, and this is purely anecdotal, there are no statistics on this, but prior to COVID, we would work up and down the West Bank in villages and towns and refugee camps. And what was noticeable was, in every case, the issue of collaboration would always come up in conversation. And we would ask people their sense of how extensive it is. And generally, in most villages and towns, what people would generally tell us, is that in their belief, the level of collaboration ranged from, at the low end of the scale, about 20%, up to about 60% of the people in the village were collaborators. And that was just these individuals' assessment. Now, whether that's accurate or not, the effect of that is quite profound. If you live in a village and the military came last night and started making arrests, the talk of the village today will be, which one of my neighbors told the intelligence officer that my children were involved in stone throwing? And the effect of that after 53 years is profound. It has a profound psychological impact on people. It means that no one knows who they can trust. Which one of your neighbors is the collaborator? And people might have an exaggerated view, who knows, of how many people in the village are collaborators. But the mere belief that your village is infiltrated to a large extent, like I said, does have a profound impact on people. And essentially what it does after 53 years, it starts to unravel the social fabric. And in the 14 years I've been here, this I think is probably the best evidence I've seen to explain why you see very little coherent resistance in the West Bank, whether it's military, peaceful, or political, because it's so difficult to organize for that reason. So what happens is the intelligence officer makes contact with any informants in the village and puts together a list of names of people to arrest. That list might be accurate, half accurate, complete rubbish. The beauty of this system from the Israeli military's perspective is even if that list of names is completely inaccurate, the system still works quite well, very well, I should say, because it basically based on the idea of collective punishment. Someone or a group of people in that village threw stones, in more probably than not. Someone from that village will pay a price for that. It's not completely, it's not arbitrary. The intelligence officers do want to identify the actual stone throwers. But like I said, if the intelligence they get from the informants is inaccurate, then the system still works. You still send that message to the village. I should also add that there's also an incentive on people to provide that information, and that if you are collaborating and you're receiving cash payments or work permits in return for that information, it's in your interest to provide information whether you have it or not. So what happens then? The intelligence officer puts together a list of names. That's then handed back to the military commander responsible for that location. It's his job then to make those arrests. He will make those arrests within 48 hours of the incident. That's important so the village understands cause and effect. You resist, you will get a visit from the military within 48 hours until you appreciate that resistance is futile. Usually those arrests occur in the middle of the night. There are a number of practical reasons why the military arrests people in the middle of the night. First one is if you show up at 2 o'clock in the morning, the person is likely to be home. The second one is if you send heavily armed soldiers into, say, a refugee camp during the day, almost certainly young men will come out and throw stones. You'll have a riot. Sometimes the military wants to create unrest and riots in that situation. You only have to read some of the testimonies from Breaking the Silence, former Israeli soldiers, to appreciate that that is a tactic. What they call it is making their presence felt. They go into a village during the day, stir everyone up, make arrests, etc. Basically putting people on the back foot so they never know when the military will come into their village. But if you don't want to cause a riot and you're the military commander, you can send the army in at 2 o'clock in the morning. Final reason the army goes in at 2 o'clock in the morning is probably the most important. And that is if you send heavily armed soldiers into a civilian center of population at 2 in the morning, it has a tendency to terrify people. And what we've noticed is night raids are an extremely effective way of intimidating communities in the West Bank into submission. If it is a night raid, like I said, it will occur usually between midnight and 5, typically about 2. It will normally begin with aggressive banging at the front door. If you don't open it up quickly, that door will be blown off its hinges. Sometimes the military gains access to the house quietly without waking anyone up. And we document cases, they're on our website, of children waking up with soldiers actually in their bedroom. You hear a noise, you open your eyes, you have 5 soldiers in your bedroom. Whichever technique is used to gain access to the house, what will happen is everyone generally will be gathered in the living room, IDs will be checked, and the person they've come to arrest will be taken away. Usually that person will be blindfolded and tied, whether it's an adult or child. Most cases, no information is provided. Sometimes a pro forma document is given to the parents, written in Arabic and Hebrew, or typed in Arabic and Hebrew, but the actual relevant information has to be filled in by the officer. And if he fills it in at all, he fills it in Hebrew, so it's not particularly useful. If that document conveys anything, it simply conveys which interrogation center the child will be taken to, nothing about your legal rights. So then the detainee, whether it's an adult or child, is taken away, put in the back of a vehicle, driven off. Eventually, they'll end up at one of the larger settlements in the West Bank, where the interrogation centers are. Ariel in the north, Gush Etzion in the south, Binyamin near Ramallah, typically. It can take up to about 5 to 10 hours before you get to one of those centers, not because they're far away, but frequently the convoy will make other arrests. The soldiers will stop off at military bases, etc. Typically, you're going to remain tied and blindfolded most of that time. It is completely ad hoc, though. It depends on the soldier guarding you. We document cases where soldiers will do what they can to treat the detainee with a degree of dignity and respect. Some will untie the individual, make sure they have a blanket, get them something to eat or drink. That's the rarity. In most cases, though, you will remain tied and blindfolded. And we document cases of people being slapped, kicked, pushed, that sort of thing. Again, it really depends on the disposition of the 26-year-old officer in charge, how you're treated. So eventually, like I said, you will end up in an interrogation center in one of those larger settlements, maybe 10 hours after you arrest. You've probably been tied and blindfolded that entire time. The effect of that is, whether you've been assaulted or not, just the act of being tied and blindfolded significantly degrades you psychologically, degrades your ability to resist in any way. And that's deliberate. And that is so that when you are sitting in the interrogation room, it's much easier for the interrogator to get a confession out of you. And that's generally what we find. Now, under military law, Israeli military law, or any military law, you have less rights than under civilian law, which is why it's supposed to be temporary. But you still do have some rights. So under Israeli military law, you have the right generally to consult with a lawyer. There are exceptions, but they generally do not apply to children. You have the right to silence. These rights are, for the most part, disregarded. There's been a little bit of improvement in the last 5 years or so, but generally those rights in the overwhelming majority of cases will be disregarded. And essentially the techniques employed by the interrogators, particularly with children who are in this psychologically weakened position from being tied and blindfolded and arrested in the middle of the night, is to mix intimidation with aggressive behavior and threats. Sometimes there's physical violence, but generally the interrogator doesn't, in many cases, need to resort to violence to get a confession in a situation like this. Simply by approaching the child and yelling at the person, saying, "We'll arrest," making threats, "We'll arrest your mother and sister if you don't confess. You will go to prison for a long time if you don't confess, or we'll cancel your father's work permit if you don't confess." That's often sufficient to get a confession. One thing all the interrogators will do as well is they will tell the person that all of the other people they arrested with that person have already confessed, and they already said that you, if you're in that situation, were they confessed against you, said you were involved in stone throwing like they were. And you're told because they confessed, they've all been sent home. So you're the only one sitting in the police station. That has quite a compelling effect on people. When you tell people that in a high pressure situation such as this, frequently that person will, whether they've done it or not, will simply confess, give up a few names of their friends. Why not? They gave up your name in the belief that then you go home. Often what you find out subsequently is no one's confessed against you. You were actually the first person to provide the confession. And then the interrogator will go to the next room and use the same tactic on that person. So say you just confess, your friend just confessed against you, etc., etc. And that's generally the substantive evidence in these cases is one person's confession against everyone else's. Everybody provides confessions in the belief that they will go home. Completely unreliable, but that is the main source of evidence. Within several days, you find yourself then in one of the two military courts in the West Bank, one near between Ramallah and Jerusalem, the other one near Jenin. Often that's where you'll see your lawyer for the first time. Even if you tell your lawyer you're innocent, your lawyer will, in most cases, still advise you to plead guilty. And the reason for that is if you plead guilty, whether you did it or not, you accept a plea bargain, typically you're looking at about 3 to 4 months in prison and a fine. If on the other hand, you want to challenge the case, say you want to argue that you were coerced into providing a confession, you will almost certainly be denied bail, which means you're going to have to sit in prison waiting for a trial date. That frequently takes up to 6 months. So often it's just quicker to plead guilty than to challenge the system. The latest official statistics I've seen is the conviction rate for children is about 95%. It's actually come down a bit, used to be 99.74%. And the reason for that is almost everyone, whether they're innocent or guilty, will ultimately plead guilty in this system. I noticed the time, so I'll just quickly wrap it up. So you go off, you serve your prison term, your parents will also be fined. That has a controlling effect on these communities. If the military wants to control a community, they'll go in constantly, arrest people, prosecute them in the military courts, and basically bankrupt the village into submission through fines. The last data I saw, official data, was military courts were raising in 2017 $6 million in fines. That money generally comes from people who live in Area C next to settlements. These are poor communities. That has a profound impact on them. So after you've served your 3 or 4 months in prison, you go home. What we tend to find, and there are plenty of exceptions, but generally speaking, this is a very effective system. Whether it's an adult or child, most people come out of this system intimidated. They never want to see another soldier again. They will never want to see a settler again. They'll do everything they can to avoid roads used by settlers. Now, from the military commander's perspective, he's achieved his mission. He's intimidated that generation of young people or that community into submission, so they do not object in any meaningful way to the settlement being constructed next door. Bottom line is, there's no nice way of doing settlement construction in occupied territory. That's why it's illegal. And if you are going to build settlements in occupied territory and you have to guarantee the protection of the people living there, you will have to engage inevitably in conduct such as I've described in order to keep that casualty rate down. So I'll stop, that's 30 minutes. I'll stop there to give people time to ask questions.
Thank you, Gerard. Just a reminder for folks to write their questions in the chat, and we hope to get to them. And yeah, wow, Gerard, you definitely have showed us just the insidious system that is this colonization project in Palestine and the psychological torment that this process of arrest of children has on entire communities. So thank you for sharing with us that really important information. So one of our questions we have is, who keeps the military accountable for their behavior?
Yeah, so there's, like most militaries around the world, or many militaries around the world, there are internal mechanisms. There are obviously regulations. There's no shortage of regulations, right down to when you can tie someone, when you can't, when you, how you're supposed to treat them. That's not really the problem. The problem is that these regulations are generally completely ignored. There are complaint mechanisms. But the thing with these complaint mechanisms is, if you're a Palestinian and you wish to lodge a complaint against, you allege you were mistreated by a soldier in the West Bank, the place you have to go to lodge your complaint generally is a police station inside a settlement. Now, if you've just been beaten up by a settler or a soldier, probably the last place you ever want to go to is a settlement to lodge a complaint. And a number of Israeli organizations have engaged in this complaints mechanism quite extensively over the years. If you're interested in more details, I can recommend the website of Yesh Din. They've got a lot of statistics, but generally what you find, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but generally you find out of all of the complaints that are filed, nothing happens. Very rarely does the complaint go anywhere at all, to the extent that after, I can't remember, but I think it was something like 20 years of filing complaints, the Israeli organization B'Tselem about 2 or 3 years ago, stopped doing it. They said this is basically giving a fig leaf to the occupation. It's making the occupation look like there are accountability mechanisms. So what's the problem? But their experience was there is no accountability, so they're not going to be part of that system anymore.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two of the questions that we have, because someone is asking, like, what is the long-term effects on children that go through this? But also a question coming through is around how is like deliberately arresting children being used to try and break a generation? And what does this mean for the future? What are the long-term impacts of this?
So obviously, different people are affected in different ways. But one of my colleagues who often joins me in these presentations, Sawa, she meets with many of these families, collects testimonies up and down the West Bank. And she has many, many stories of the long-term impact of this. A couple that spring to mind is she was in a village and talking to, I think interviewing a child. And the mother said that her husband, who's 40 years old, was arrested when he was 13, 14, 15, a child. And to this very day, when the Israeli military come into their village, he will basically run home. He doesn't want, it's had a lifetime impact on him. It traumatized him to the extent he just cannot bear to see soldiers, and so will go home. In another case, I remember her saying that there was, she was interviewing a family, and a 6 or 7 year old child ran into the room screaming hysterically, and the mother tried to comfort him and asked what the issue was. And he pointed out the window, and way off in the distance, out of the village, but coming towards the village, were a couple of Israeli military jeeps, several kilometers away. But because his house had been raided some time before, just seeing military jeeps several kilometers away created that response in that child. And again, like I said, 53 years of this, it wears down these communities. To the second question about targeting children, you often hear that their military may be targeting children. That may or may not be the case. I haven't seen necessarily evidence of that. But what happens is, generally, usually there is an incident. Something generally will happen. I mean, it might be very minor, like it is an offense for people to protest, for people to gather. So you might have a village where a lot of people gather. They want to protest against the settlement next door. It might be peaceful. It might not be. Some people might be throwing stones. Who knows? So there is a situation that the military needs to deal with. Many of those people at that protest will be young people, and the soldiers are just going to catch anyone that will arrest anyone that they can grab at what is under military law an illegal gathering. And so inevitably it's the young people that get arrested in that situation. Were they deliberately targeted? They were targeted because they were there, essentially.
Thank you. And also because I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to all the questions, so I'm trying to combine them a bit. But are there international campaigns that are trying to put pressure on Israel to stop this? I know many folks in this group are familiar with Defense for Children International. Is this a group that you work with to try and get the news out? But yeah, what is being done on the international level to try and stop this behavior?
Yes, I mean, a lot's been done over many, many years. Like prior to COVID and hopefully after COVID, like I said, or when we were talking earlier, we take over 100 delegations a year, brief over 100 delegations a year. We take many of those delegations to the military courts. So over the years, we've briefed over 15% of the UK Parliament and taken them to the military courts. The result of that is there have been 4 debates in the UK Parliament on this issue. and similar things, you know, in other parliaments, etc., around the world. So there's plenty being done. Also, I have to say, we brief all the diplomats here, American, European, etc. We've taken most of them to the military courts. There's no shortage of knowledge on an official level, no shortage of knowledge at all. That's not the problem at an official level. And I think that highlights a bigger issue, and that is that, regardless of how often our politicians talk about a rules-based international legal system or order, it's quite obvious we don't live in a rules-based system. We live in an interest-based system. Now, rules are often invoked when it comes to Russia or China. When it comes to a strategic adversary of the West, then we will invoke the rule of law, we'll invoke Security Council resolutions, and we'll dress everything up in the language of the law. When it comes to a strategic partner, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Israel, then we seem to get a bit wobbly and shaky on the rule of law. And I think Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. Both, I know, Britain and the United States have excellent relations with Saudi Arabia, a country we probably have absolutely nothing in common with. We share no values whatsoever, quite possibly, with that country. Why do we do that? Because it's a counterbalance to Iran, and we sell lots of weapons to them. It's interests. And that's at the heart and the dilemma of this issue, I think, that if it was truly a rules-based order, there's no shortage of rules. And there's, the law is quite clear what should happen here. But because Israel is a strategic partner, for example, in the UK, most of our Middle East intelligence comes from Israel. The British government's not going to jeopardize that relationship, for Palestine. That's the way, it's very transactional, international relations. What can you do for me? What can I do for you? And unfortunately, Palestine being a small place, a weak place, there's not much Palestine can offer. And that's where we have to do our best to try and look at ways where we can possibly invoke the law, as difficult as it may be, and also sort of mass movements to change the political debate so that it is more of a rules-based system, like our politicians would like us to believe, rather than rules for some and interests for others. That's the dilemma. I think holding our own politicians accountable, and I think there's a lot to be said for very focused campaigns. So the day that we can target one MP, one member of Congress who's a outspoken advocate support of whether it's Saudi Arabia or whether it's Israel, and turns a blind eye to the human rights abuse, to organize a focused campaign to remove that person from office, so that everyone knows that person was removed from office because of that one-sided policy position. That's when you might have a chance to start making some change. But that requires a lot of organization, sometimes a lot of money too. But I think something like that can be effective. Just a slightly on the legal aspect, everyone would know that the ICC, International Criminal Court, recently ruled that it does have jurisdiction over Palestine. Again, to give you an example of how we live in an interest-based system rather than a rules-based system, though, there have been a lot of reports following that decision that Israel has approached and been approached by European and others, governments, giving mutual assurances, that advance warning will be given to Israeli officials if an arrest warrant is issued. And those are some of the things we have to try and work against. To ask questions about parliamentarians. What assurances have been given by the US government, the Canadian government, etc., or have any assurances been given to Israeli officials regarding prosecution at the ICC, and what are those assurances? And if assurances were given, were the same assurances given to Africans who were prosecuted in the International Criminal Court? And if not, why not?
Thank you, Gerard. And I think that really gets to like the global apartheid and inequality that exists in this world, that this is a global issue for sure. And we have to figure out how to fight strategically. One last question. Apparently there is proposed US legislation to withhold US aid until Israel ends the military arrest process and changes to a civilian policing system. I'm not aware of this legislation, but someone is wondering if you have heard of this, and is this being discussed in Israel, or does it have even any real teeth to it?
I'm aware of it. It's highly problematic. It relies on the Lay Amendment in under US law. Basically what that is, that's a law that the US cannot give military assistance to any country where that military assistance will directly be involved in human rights abuses. It's very focused and very carefully drafted to ensure that you have to link the actual military aid, that precise military aid, with a precise human rights abuse. It's not surprising it's that precise, because if it was just general, like if you're giving money to a country and they commit human rights abuses, America would not be able to support Saudi Arabia. They would not be able to support Egypt. The second biggest recipient of US military aid is Egypt, most likely because of the Suez Canal. You don't, if it was simply, and that obviously a lot of human rights abuses in Egypt. And so it is drafted very precisely because the US doesn't want to have to cut off aid to all of these countries. But if you can show, say, a shipment of assault rifles were supplied to a particular unit and that was used in a human rights abuse, then aid can be cut off. But it's that level of, and the problem is, in the 14 years I've been here, not a single US dollar in military aid has had been directed towards or has anything to do with child detention. The US military aid budget is about $4 billion a year. Under the Obama administration, they changed the situation. It used to be 80% of that military aid had to be spent in the United States. Only 20% could be spent in Israel. Under Obama, it was changed to 100%. So 100% of that $4 billion has to be spent in the United States, buying things like F-35 fighter jets, that sort of thing. So basically, and that's another dilemma we have in many respects, is not only is that $4 billion military aid to Israel, another way of looking at it is it's almost got nothing to do with Israel. It's a subsidy to Boeing and other weapons manufacturers in the US. And the way companies like Boeing have been quite clever. What they've done is they've cut up their manufacturing process across almost 50 states, which means if you cut off that aid, people will lose their jobs in almost every one of those 50 states. And no member of Congress is going to vote for that.
Yeah, thank you. And suddenly this huge human rights issue in Palestine becomes a labor issue in the United States.
And as much as people might be sympathetic for Palestinians, Americans are going to care about their jobs more than anyone else. And that's not surprising in some respects.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you so much for your response, Gerard. I feel like I could listen to you all day, but unfortunately we don't have time to answer every question. So I'd like to point you to our Kumi entry in action for the week. Links will be shared later. But I also want to point out today, Mariana Harris and Dorcas Gordon have asked to share a bit of an advocacy initiative that's happening in Canada. So I'm wondering if one of you can just share very briefly what's going on. Go ahead, Mariana.
Okay, I think we both want to say something briefly.
Oh,
and
okay.
as Gerard was talking, it occurred to me that I think we want to do is, one of the things is to repurpose that word collaboration and to invite Canadians to collaborate on an action that we hope might wake up our government. So last year, people across Canada signed an e-petition asking our government to appoint a special envoy to investigate the treatment of Palestinian child prisoners. After 4 months of gathering signatures, the petition was presented in Parliament, and we received a response saying, oh yeah, the Canadian government is monitoring what's going on. Some people were dissatisfied with this response and wanted to continue pressing our government. And we wanted to educate the Canadian public and encourage them to join us in expressing their shock and dismay at what is happening. So now we have a group that has Mennonites, United Church, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Unitarians laying the foundation for this work. And people from across the whole country are involved. And Dorcas is going to talk about the concept of the special envoy.
The group recognizes that it needs not only to have a strong process beforehand, but it needs to be wise in what is included in the petition that requests the special envoy. And also we need to be even wiser to ensure the best we can that the right person is appointed. The government of Canada's interests have been firmly aligned with Israel over the past number of decades. Our voting record at the UN in support of Palestine has been abysmal. So we recognize that it won't be easy to see this appointment realized. One of the things we have done is to scrutinize a report by a special envoy appointed by the government to investigate the Rohingya crisis. As a result, we recognize certain things that need to be in a petition, almost like a job description of what we want a special envoy to do. Things like provide a description of the situation that privileges listening to the voices of the victim. A request including commentary, in spite of what Gerard just said, on Canada's commitment to international law and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Another section would be on accountability related to action, and a very important section on recommendations with some sort of timeline for the realization. All of this was part and parcel of what the special envoy on the Rohingya crisis did, and we want to parallel our request on this. We're equally concerned that the person to be appointed needs to be just the right person, because if it's left to the government, we'll likely get someone in there as special envoy who is completely aligned with Israel's interests. So a lot of wisdom is needed. And as Marianne said, our big thing is to raise the profile of the Palestinian situation before the Canadian public, and hope that this is a way that we'll begin to do that. So that's our plan. Mariana?
So we'd invite Canadians that are interested in being part of that to be in touch with Dorcas, Kathy Bergen, Linda Scherzinger, or I, and we can get you involved in the MailChimp, where you'll learn about our actions as they're evolving. And I know it was a bit discouraging to hear what Gerard had to say as to whether this is going to be effective or not, but we got to believe in something and keep working at it. So thank you.
It sounds like a very good initiative. Can I just add something that one strategy that might also assist is if you can gather as many MPs as you can to back the petition. Some have probably been here, some might be sympathetic, and because that's what's worked well in the UK. 15% of the parliament have been to the military courts. If you can get more and more Canadian MPs to hear a briefing and go to the military courts, after COVID, you will then have support, a core of support in Parliament, which will give your petition perhaps more weight.
Yeah. So 18 MPs visited 2 or 3 years ago, and actually it was out of their visit that this idea, this special envoy came out. So, but we can keep working on the MPs for sure.
Excellent.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And now we're going to talk about our Kumi action for this week. So we are going to ask that if it's safe where you are, to host a potluck and a screaming at your home, your school, your church, or synagogue. I mean, there's all kinds of tech now. You can probably do a special Zoom watch if you are still in a place that you have to do things online, and watch the documentary Stone Cold Justice, which can be found on the Military Court Watch website. A link will be shared in the chat. And while you're doing this film screening, we ask that you share a photo of you doing this film screening on social media. Include a link to this page of the Kumi Now website, which is also shared in the chat, along with the hashtags #Kumi Now and #Kumi14. And also, I'd like to give Gerard an opportunity to chime in. Do you have any thoughts on the Kumi action or other ways people watching can help address the situation around minors in military courts?
Like I said, I think one of the most effective things, again, this is a post-COVID thing, but one of the most effective things we've seen is trying to, in order to get change, I think we need to make this more of a mainstream issue. And if you can get like more conservative people to go to the military courts, that can be very powerful. You know, if you can put together a delegation, maybe of former judges, that sort of thing. Like there was a legal delegation from the UK, came out in 2011, published a report in 2012, and it had it was very useful from an advocacy perspective. It had a former attorney general and a Court of Appeal judge, amongst others, on the team. That sort of thing. So think about in your networks, who do you know, or who do you know who knows someone like that, who, you know, you can, in a sense, find a champion who will be able to persuade more conservative-minded people, whether in Parliament or just in the general public, that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. And I think that was a tactic used by the Quakers in the abolitionist movement. They looked around to see, you know, could they find a really appalling conservative in the UK Parliament? And they found Lord Wilberforce. He had terrible views on most things, but he was anti-slaver. And I think that just undercut the market for appalling conservatives. You know, if you can get someone who's conservative arguing for a position, that's going to be more likely to mainstream the issue than if you have someone of the left, you know, or perhaps the far left, advocating for it. It probably will not come, it won't come out of the far left if you just keep it there. So think of ways you can mainstream it, make it a you know, a more widespread kind of movement with these kind of more conservative voices.
Thank you, Gerard. And thank you everyone for joining us today. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so. Just take some time to upload it all. And it will be shared in the newsletter. So you can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. And then of course, send it all out to your family, your community, your network, so that the learning keeps growing. And next week, we will address the issue of home demolitions. So if you'd like to be reminded of the online gatherings an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at thekuminow.com/online using the form at the bottom of the page. And so we hope to see you all back here next week, and have a great night, have a great day, depending which time zone that you are in. And just thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks again, Gerard.
Thank you. Thanks.